and this is Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. I'm your host, Monica Hadley, and with me is my co-host, Caroline Kilburn.
And good afternoon, everyone. You know, when I came over here from Mount Pleasant, it was completely cloud cover.
Oh!
Then I come out from the restaurant, and it's blue sky.
Yeah, and we really need some rain.
Yeah, I thought, it's going to rain, but oh well. Now it's trying to get cloudy again, so we'll see.
We're hoping. So today we have an author with her first novel, and it's a really good read. It is. I read it cover to cover. Stayed up too late. Reading.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Why don't you introduce our author today, Mom?
Okay, our author today is Ladee Hubbard, and she is a winner of the 2016 Ronna Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, the William Faulkner William Wisdom Creative Writing Competition, and has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize. She holds a BA from Princeton University, an MFA in Dramatic Writing from New York University, an MFA in Creative Writing from the University of Wisconsin, my goodness, and a PhD from the University of California. And she lives in New Orleans, and she is a very, very accomplished writer, and this is a book well worth reading.
Welcome to Writers' Voices, Ladee.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
So I'm guessing that one of the questions that I like to ask is, did you always want to be a writer? And I'm pretty sure I know what the answer to that is.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so. I think I've always loved writing. I didn't know. I mean, it wasn't always a professional aspiration of mine. Like, I will be a professional writer, but I absolutely I've written from a very young age. So yeah, I've always really enjoyed it.
So have you had another profession other than a writer?
I was a professor. I taught at Tulane University, which I'm actually doing right now as well. That's why I moved to New Orleans originally, was to teach at Tulane University. So I was putting that PhD to use.
So you teach writing?
I'm sorry?
Do you teach writing?
No. I taught in the Africana Studies department. And I also taught in theater and dance for a little while as well.
Many talented.
And the title of this book, your book, is The Talented Ribkins.
Yes. Now,
one of the things that caught my eye when I read about your book was that it was inspired by an essay, and I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce his name right, but by W.E.B. Du Bois in the early 1900s, called The Talented Tenth. And it just happens to be that he showed up in my life in letters or something that I read like 3 times within 2 days. So tell us a little bit about Du Bois and why he inspires you.
Oh, that's really interesting. W.E.B. Du Bois, he wrote the essay The Talented Tenth back in 1903, and it's really a very impassioned plea for provisions to be made so that African Americans can have access to a liberal arts education. Because at that time, there were a lot of people who didn't think that African Americans should have access to any education, or else it should just be vocational training. So the essay proposes that while a classical education might not be appropriate for the entire population, he sets out this theory that there is 1/10 of the population that has the natural sort of gifts or talent that they would benefit from a liberal arts education, and they would become sort of the leadership class of African Americans. So it's articulated as making this claim that you should educate the talented tenth, and so that they're prepared to assume sort of the mantle of the leadership for all African Americans. But really, at base, he's arguing for some sort of provisions to be made in the South so that African Americans will have access at all.
So it isn't that he didn't think that everyone deserved access.
I see. That's part of why the essay becomes a little controversial, because it's often interpreted as elitist. That he's saying there are some people that have more natural gifts than others, but within the context, I tend to personally interpret it more as just he's trying to find a way to communicate to a specific audience that might be opposed to having all African Americans, or not see the benefit or usefulness of all African Americans receiving this kind of education. And so he's postulating that there is a percentage of the population that should. But that's part of what makes the essay a little bit tricky and controversial for a lot of people. I'm in the book, I'm interested in specifically what he says in the essay, but also sort of how the essay has been interpreted, and how it's perceived in popular culture. People that are familiar with the term the talented tenth, and sort of all the associations that people have with that term.
So how did you get from the talented tenth to the talented Ribkins?
Yeah. Well, one thing that the book does is sort of literalize the idea of talent or natural ability, so that all of the characters in this family, it's about the Ribkins family, which is an African-American family in Florida, and they're all born with unique and somewhat obscure talents. So in this case, the talents are: one can see in the dark, one can pick any lock, one can climb any wall, and the main character can make perfect maps of any landscape that he drives through. So the book kind of literalizes the idea of being born. These are literal talents. And part of the point is that they don't, it's not like they have an obvious use value. So part of what the characters are struggling with is trying to figure out what it means to be talented, and how they can best put their talents to good use.
Mm. So now the mapping talent was the one that was a little hard to understand.
Yeah.
Of Johnny Ribkins?
Yes,
mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's his talent, and another thing that happens in the book is that these abilities are very much connected to their personalities. So the way in which he moves through life is very much affected by his talent, or what he sees that sort of sets him apart from other people. So some of it has to do, I think parts of it that are confusing has to do with the way in which he interacts with other people because of it, and also because it very closely parallels his perspective. It is presented as how he experiences his talent.
Well, I got the feeling that it wasn't just that he could make perfect maps of any landscape he drove through, but he could make maps of things of places he hadn't even been physically.
Yes, yeah,
okay.
Because it's in part about they're conceptual maps also, and he does talk about that. He tries to. It's funny because he actually says at one point that he doesn't understand why it's so confusing for other people what it is he does and what he's trying to do, but that's actually his inability to articulate what it is he's trying to do is one of the problems in his life, and it comes up a lot because it seems very simple and self-evident to him. But it also, at one point he says he's trying to make a map that has an extra dimension, a fourth dimension, a dimension of time, and because it is in part it's about theorizing, and so it's a map as sort of a conceptual framework for action. That's how he conceives of it, and that's probably why it gets a little less clear, because it is very much what the book is describing is his experience of his power. And similarly, what Eloise says is her power is that's the way she presents it to other people, and it's accepted that way, and that's ultimately proves that's not necessarily accurate.
Right.
Well, I can.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Well, at one point, didn't he make maps to show during the civil rights movement to show where people could go and be welcome to buy gas and so forth? And
Yes. At one point, he has. He really, when the book starts, he's 72 years old, and he's in a very sort of cynical place. And what he's doing is he owes a debt. He's gotten into debt with a gangster, and he has to pay off all of this money. So he's driving around Florida, and he's digging up money that he's buried in holes in the ground at various points in his past. Trying to raise the money to pay off this debt. So doing that forces him to sort of confront whatever unfinished business he left in his past. So for him, it's like retracing his steps of his life. And he has spent, you realize over the course of a novel, most of his life trying to figure out how he can use his talent for good. And usually it doesn't work out or hasn't worked out the way he hoped. A lot of times his plans and he maps everything out and then it backfires anyway. But at one point he did have a job where he made maps for African American motorists who were traveling through the South, so that they would know where it was safe for them to sort of get off the highway, and because of segregation and things like that, where they could get gas and supplies, places that, gas stations that would serve them and stuff like that. So that's one of the many jobs he's had in the past.
Well, it's interesting too, as he connects with his relatives along the way. Mm-hmm. He tries to help them out, and then he has enough money. Then he doesn't have enough money. Then he has to go find more money.
Right. He always seems like he's almost got what he needs to pay off his debt, and then he realizes there's there's another debt in a sense that he has to pay off as well.
Uh-huh.
And at the same time, he's trying to unravel kind of a mystery about his brother too.
Yes. So he is. He's accompanied on this trip that he's taking with his niece, Eloise, who's the daughter of his half-brother. He has a half-brother who is deceased, and he has a lot of guilt about his brother's death, and he feels like he did not do a very good job of caring for his brother. So while he's going through his past, he's also dealing with that as well. And he has a lot of guilt and grief about his brother's passing.
And how much younger was his brother?
His brother is 20 years younger than him.
Okay.
And they're half brothers on his father's side, and so he didn't know he had a brother until he was in his 40s. So by the time they met, his younger brother was already a grown man.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Ladee Hubbard, author of The Talented Ribkins. I'm just curious where you got the idea for this. I mean, I know you were inspired by The Talented Tenth, but it's a bit of a leap from that to this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's drawing on a lot of. I think the book draws on a lot of different things I was concerned with, different things I was interested in coming together in a specific way. The name The Talented Tenth was always kind of, it's not a joke, but it is kind of funny because it does sound like a superhero group, like the Fantastic Four, something, the Talented Tenth, and they are sort of, in the essay he writes about them, they're going to save, they're going to save the entire race and stuff like that. So they are sort of written about in superheroic terms. And then also, I think some of the ideas that came up in the essay and also on my reflections of them, I wanted to personalize by making it a family of a story. A story of a family. Excuse me.
Yeah.
A story of a family. So they're all of the family members that you meet as he's taking this journey through his past. They're all talented. They all have these unique talents, and that doesn't mean they get along or agree on how people should live their lives or what is the best way that you can utilize their talents. So they have a lot of they argue a lot. So those are just two things. I think there's just a lot. It's just a way that a lot of different ideas sort of came together and took shape for me when I was writing it. So
it
is a leap. So
is The Talented Ribkins the first novel that you've written? I know it is. It's the first you've published, but a lot of people don't publish their first or second or third novels. So this is actually the first one you've written.
This is the first one I've written and finished. Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I've written a lot of short stories and poems before I wrote this, but yeah, this is the first novel.
And how long did you spend working on it?
4 years. 4 years. I was writing this. I was teaching at Tulane, and I realized I wanted to write a novel. And actually, the first, I wrote a short story. The first chapter was a short story that I had published before, and then I realized I wanted to expand it into a novel, so I applied to an MFA program so that I would have 2 years to just focus on writing, and that's what I did, and I wrote most of it during those 2 years.
So you were doing the MFA program full time?
Mm-hmm.
And did you stay in New Orleans, or did you?
No, it was in Madison, Wisconsin. It was at the University of Wisconsin. And it was really great. It was perfect for me. It's a very small program, and you get a lot of support, and I got a lot of feedback, and I learned a lot about writing. So it was very nice for me, also just to be for a little bit of time, surrounded by other people that are really just focused on their craft. That was very helpful. For me, just to have that focus.
So you knew you wanted to write this book, you knew you needed to set aside the time to do it, but to quit a job and take and actually, if you're going to an MFA program that costs money, that's a huge commitment, isn't it?
Well, I got a fellowship to go, so that really did help quite a bit. But it's a huge leap of faith. And actually, I had my 3 children went there with me. My youngest was 4 months old when I started the program. So it was a huge leap of faith, and I'm sure a lot of people. It was a very questionable decision, but I'm really glad that I did it, because I'm sure it would have. I mean, maybe I would have written this novel, but I'm sure it would have taken me a lot longer than 4 years to have done it. So.
And you made some. I imagine you made a lot of connections there too.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I did meet a lot of really great writers, and I met my agent when I was there, my literary agent while I was there. So she read a very early draft of the book and saw something in it. So that was very helpful as well. So.
Now I've noticed that the blurb on the front jacket is from Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
Not a lot of first-time novelists get that kind of push from someone like her. How did that come about?
Well, I knew when I was, she was my thesis advisor in college. I went to Princeton, and she's a huge part of why I wanted to go there and then stay there, was because I had so much. I was such a huge fan of her work. So that's how I initially met her.
Wow. So you stayed in touch with her over the years since then? And
I really didn't. I really appreciate. I told her about the book and I sent it to her and she read it. So it means a great deal, obviously to me personally, because she really is the person that inspired me to want to write. She was a hugely inspirational figure in my life. So I really appreciate her taking the time to read it when I finally finished a novel. So.
And what was your path to publication like? You said you met your agent while you were in the MFA program. Mm-hmm. Once you were ready to start, so that must have been nice to know that you had somebody. Once the book was finished, that you already had someone lined up to sell it for you?
Yeah, it took a long... I had to... It was a lot of revisions. I think after I finished the MFA, it's been about 2... I revised it many times before we sent it out. So... it was really nice to have someone that, saw something in my work and believed in me, but it was still, it still needed a lot of work, which I'm actually really grateful for, because I feel like I learned how to write a novel from writing this novel. Like I feel like I had to write one all the way through and go through all the revisions to really understand how to write a novel. So I learned a tremendous amount by doing this. So
well, it doesn't.
It was a long process.
It feels very complete. There isn't any place where I felt like, oh, this. And I do get books, honestly, that people who want to be on the show that I say there's something here, but this book they didn't finish editing this. And
when they leave you hanging about something,
or if the language is just too too many words to say things, and too much telling, not showing. There's that old show don't tell thing, which is really true. And you don't necessarily know when you're reading something that's not following that, except that it's not that much fun to read. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I had to work through it. I finished technically the book after about 2 years, and I spent just as much time revising it and trying to deal with all those things you just mentioned. Right.
And now, were you in an MFA program where you had an opportunity to workshop the book with other students?
Yeah. I did. Yeah. And that was really helpful.
It can be hard too, though, can't it? It's like it's your baby, and people are cutting it up.
Right. No, it is hard. But it's hard to. A lot of things are hard. They're very valuable. I think you have to be able to deal with criticism, and it's not that you have to take everything people say to heart, but you have to decide for yourself if you know why you did something, and then be true to that and stick with that as well. So I think it's good to hear the kinds of things that people, even if they don't love it, listen to what they're saying, and it was very helpful for me, because then it made me think, why did you do that? And if there was a reason why I did that, then I would be true to that. So it was very helpful in terms of developing a thicker skin in terms of stuff like that, and also being a little bit more practical about dealing with critiques and criticism. So
I was wondering if you had to do research about the civil rights movement in order to get the feel of this whole thing.
Well, yeah, I have done a lot of research on the civil rights movement, more when I was teaching, because I taught it was an Africana Studies here at Tulane. So in relation to my academic work, I had already done a lot of research on the civil rights movement, among other things. So
that was helpful then, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very helpful. I know I've done all these, I've kind of done a lot of different things in my life, and they all, it was nice to write this book because a lot of them sort of came together. It was all useful for writing this book.
Now, The Talented Ribkins is set in Florida, and Johnny and Eloise are driving from one town to another, and there's a lot of detail about locations. Are these all locations that you were familiar with, or that you went to, or did you use Google Earth to get the details right?
I'm very familiar with a lot of them. When I was growing up, I lived with my mother. We moved around a lot, but every summer I went to stay with my grandparents who live in St. Petersburg, Florida. So I actually spent a lot of time in Florida when I was growing up. So a lot of these places are pretty familiar to me because of that.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Ladee Hubbard, author of The Talented Ribkins. Ladee, why don't you read a little bit from the opening of the book to give us a feel for it?
Okay. All right, I'll read from the first chapter, which is called The Last Woman. He only came back because Melvin said he would kill him if he didn't pay off his debt by the end of the week. It was why he left St. Augustine, why he had no choice but to drive down to Lehigh Acres and dig up the box of money he'd buried in his brother's yard 14 years before. The only complication was his brother's last woman, who was still living in the house, because of course he didn't want her knowing what he was after. So he made something up. A toolbox, Johnny Ribkins said, standing on the splintered porch of a wood-framed two-story, while hard slats of Florida sunshine bore down on his back, and the woman squinted from behind the screen door. A toolbox, she said, great grapes masking her face like a veil. Why you got a toolbox buried in the yard? Oh, it's always been there, ever since we tore down the shed to build the basketball court. He nodded towards a weed-covered rectangle of cracked cement at the far corner of the yard. Just seemed like the safest place to put it at the time. A truck came barreling down the interstate on the other side of the fence, roar of exhaust merging with the mechanical drone of laughter coming from a TV playing inside the house. Johnny removed his hat, swatted at the moisture pooling across his brow, and stared at a rose tattoo that wound around the woman's neck. He hadn't seen her since his brother's funeral, but he had to admit she looked less crazy than he remembered. The lace top, mini skirt, and thigh-high boots were gone, replaced by a t-shirt, sweatpants, and white flip-flops. Her once gaunt cheekbones were now fleshy and jowly, and her hair, deprived of the bright red wig she'd worn to the wake, was cut short and gray. He figured she must have been in her 40s, about the same age his brother Franklin had been when he died. Johnny smiled. They're old tools, see? Like for turning screws so old they don't even make them anymore. Truth is, I all but forgot about them until a couple weeks ago, when I got a delivery of antique watches at the shop. He pulled a handkerchief from the pocket of his shirt and scratched at a line of sweat tickling his left ear. It was hot out there, and he could hear how lazy and exhausted his lies sounded. Luckily, the woman was none too bright. They valuable? Only if you're a broken watch. A hearty amen and the sound of applause came from the TV inside the house. Tools aren't valuable, the watches are, but only if they're fixed. And really it's more a matter of the fact that they don't make them anymore. Now I've looked everywhere, even tried contacting the original manufacturer to see if I could get a hold of the designs to have copies made, and where was this going? Why was he wasting time trying to explain himself to some raggedy piece of interloping woman who didn't even have sense enough to invite him inside and out of the heat, which would have been simple courtesy? He didn't have time for this. He needed to find that money, get back to St. Augustine. Is that...
Oh, no, you can keep going.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, because you want to know what happens.
St. Augustine. And so, what, Johnny, you some kind of junk man now? Ain't no fucking junk man. It popped out. But when he looked up, she was smiling. Her lip curled back to reveal the gold filling etched against her left incisor. I just thought because of the watches. You said they were old. They're antiques. He reached for his wallet. His hands were shaking as he pulled back the screen door and handed her his business card. Jonathan Ribkins, Acquisitions and Repairs, Ribkins Antiques. Family business, 2 generations. Didn't Franklin ever mention it? He worked with me for almost 12 years. No, we never discussed such things. She looked back down at the card and then back at him. For a moment, he thought he saw something crafty in her eyes, a form of coherency that hadn't been there when he met her all those years ago, else he would have remembered it. Then the TV let out another amen, and he decided she must have found Jesus and gotten off the crack. She handed him back the card. You sure that's all you want? That's all. She sighed. All you Ribkins are so peculiar, she said, then stopped because there wasn't much more to say. She shuffled down the dark hall. He waited until she was in the living room, then positioned himself at the center of the bottom step and started walking straight ahead towards the interstate. And as he walked, he couldn't help but think about how sad it was to be digging through his brother's yard again after all this time. His half-brother, some 20 years his junior, whose existence he hadn't even known about until he was a grown man, when their father got drunk at a party one night and confessed there was another son, someone named Franklin, living with his mama out in the sticks, and Johnny had been the one to go find him. He thought about all he'd been through since Franklin died, how hard he tried to put this place behind him, only to find himself at the age of 72, right back where he'd started. This was especially troubling because Johnny made maps. That was his talent, not just what he did, but who he was, the same way his brother had scaled walls. Johnny made maps and Franklin scaled walls, and for 12 years they'd made their living by selling the things they found on the other side of those walls, right there in the antique shop Johnny inherited from their father. When he'd gone 20 paces, he cocked his head to the left and started moving diagonally towards a large oak tree at the far corner of the yard. All that was supposed to have ended the day his brother died. He'd made a promise to stop stealing, start living right, start doing right, to remember what it meant to be a decent man. And everything seemed to be going according to plan until one day he looked up and realized that somehow in his grief he'd wound up working for a man who was under the mistaken impression that he owned Johnny. So here he was, 14 years later, crouched in the dirt, trying to dig up enough money to appease a criminal.
That was Ladee Hubbard reading from The Talented Ribkins, a novel. Now, this novel is it's unusual. This is an unusual book because
it is.
Yeah, it's a little bit. I don't know how to describe it. It has an element of magical realism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I asked you if they were.
Yeah, Mom asked me if these characters were real people. There's a real, there's some history to it. It's almost like it's part historical fiction, part magical realism. What else? What else would you say, Ladee?
I don't know. I mean, it is part
mystery, part mystery.
There's a lot of history. There's a lot of backstory that he goes over in the course of the novel. They're real people to me. I mean, I guess they're sort of elaborations of character traits of people that I know, or elaborations of ideas that I've heard expressed, and I don't know, maybe I made them like larger than life to a certain extent. So
yeah, I think so. But it's like I said, there's a bit of mystery. It pulls you on, wanting to know what happens. Does he get the money? Does he not get the money? What really happened to the Justice Committee? Actually, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Justice Committee? We didn't really explain what that was.
Right. So before he met his brother, he was part of a group during the 1960s, late 1960s, early 70s, and it was him and his two cousins and then two friends of theirs that were also talented, and they formed a group called the Justice Committee, and they really wanted to help with the effort of the civil rights movement, and they sort of saw themselves as doing whatever they could do to make it so that people they considered their heroes would keep going. So a lot of it has to do with security, and because his talent is map making, sort of trying to navigate ways through different obstacles. And they call themselves the Justice Committee, which is totally fictitious, and but again, it is playing on a superhero thing because it sounds like the Justice League. Again, it sounds like a superhero group, but and then it largely, mostly because of Johnny's, he sort of got a little carried away with his map making and went off on the tangent, and things got very confusing in terms of what it was the committee was supposed to be doing. They disbanded. Over the course of the book, he makes 4 stops. Well, 5 because he visits his brother's house and meets his niece, but then he makes 4 additional stops, and they're all to the other members of the Justice Committee. So that comes up a lot because as he's revisiting his past, they were all part of this group. They came together at one point and tried to use their powers for good together. They were going to be a team, and then it fell apart. And that's part of what has happened to him, because by the time he met his brother, he was already very sort of disillusioned, and he didn't really trust his own instincts anymore. He didn't really trust that he had the right to tell other people what he thought they should be doing anymore. And so, and all of this comes up in the book in terms, again, with his guilt about his brother, but also sort of his mixed feelings about his time with the Justice Committee and why they fell apart, and what happened with that. Because at one point he was very hopeful that things were going to get a lot better, and that by working together they could really help. And he became much more cynical by the time he met his brother.
Now, the family are descended from the Rib King, who made barbecue sauce, and his story is woven throughout the book, the story of the Rib King. And is that based on an actual historical figure or event?
No, not one specific one. I was really interested in how people sort of construct their identities in relationship to how they tell histories, where they came from. And so the Rib King comes up. Every character mentions him at least once, and they all have a story about the Rib King and who he was and what he stood for. And actually, they're all completely different. Like the stories contradict each other, and that had again to do with how people were sort of justifying their choices in the present by claiming, I'm part of this proud tradition, and that's why I do things the way I do them. But everyone in the book does the same thing with the Rib King. They all claim the Rib King to understand what the sort of the meaning of his life was, and they all interpret it in very, very different ways.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I didn't really see that, but now that you say it, yeah. Wow. That's
one of the reasons why this book is interesting, because you have all these
layers,
yeah.
Yeah, there's layers of meaning, all underlying just a story, a good story. But that is one of the best ways to convey a message, isn't it?
Mm.
So, Ladee, I wonder if you could read a paragraph on page 198, which when I read this, when I was reading along, I dog-eared this page because I thought, okay, this is what this story is really about for Johnny. And so it starts with the girl was right.
Oh, okay.
And you can tell me if I'm right. Is this really the heart of the story for him?
Yeah, I understand what you. I'll read it. It's important in terms of the book, yeah, and what the road trip means for him. So this is pretty. They're going to see another member who's not actually family, but is someone that was part of the Justice Committee that he has not seen. They had a horrible falling out, and he hasn't seen him in many, many years. So they're going to go see him the next day. So the paragraph is, the girl was right. His life had taken many strange swerves to get him to where he was now. If he hadn't taken Melvin's money, he might have never gone back to Lehigh Acres and might not have realized Eloise was there. And if he hadn't wound up helping both Meredith and Simone to pay off their mortgages, he wouldn't have been compelled to keep digging. He might have never looked at that picture of Meredith and therefore never realized who she was. And if he hadn't seen the picture again, he wouldn't be in Tallahassee, holding on to the hope that Flash, of all people, might have the information he needed to finally get himself out of his current bind. Every step he'd taken had led him to the next, to exactly where he was now, had become his path. All he could do was keep following it and have faith that there was a reason for it. Right path, wrong path, it was his path. And maybe the best he could do was try to be true to it. Keep going. Keep trying to be the best man he could be. Keep working to ensure that some good would come out of it. Is that the part?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So there are some things in there that refer to specific passages in the book. But yeah, in general, I think that is kind of the crux of what Johnny is realizing as a result of this trip, is that the best you can do really is the best you can do, and sometimes it's not perfect, but there's a lot of value, I think, and actually often a lot of heroism in just to keep going, to keep trying. And if you're, wrong about something, to not be afraid to learn and change your mind and to keep growing. And I think that is one of the things that is very heroic about that character. And I think that is what the journey means for him, is to realize that he didn't live up to his own expectations in a lot of ways, but there is some value in the fact that he kept trying, and he was always willing to try something different. If this doesn't work, it doesn't mean you give up. It means you try something else. You don't be afraid to learn and change and grow. He talks also around that part too about sometimes you have to how each step you take is also a new starting point, right, in terms of his map makings. And so sometimes you wind up having to map your way out of your own map, which I don't know if that makes sense to other people. Hopefully it makes more sense in context when he says it, but it does have to do with not being afraid to, like, when I, in my past, maybe I thought I knew what was going on, and now I'm like, I've learned so much more, and the way I see things around me is totally changed by that, and to not be sort of afraid to change with it, which is a big part of, I think, the message of the book. And certainly for him is to sort of discover some value in the fact that he wasn't afraid, and he did keep going and keep trying.
And for Eloise, what she needs to learn is that it's okay to be who she is.
That's right. That's right. So it's interesting because she's 13. This is his brother's daughter that he didn't know he had a niece, and they're on this road trip together. And I think that the idea of being talented, because her talent, the way she describes it, is that she can catch anything that's thrown at her. which, doesn't, I don't know how valuable necessarily. It's not an inherently valuable skill. It's made her feel very alienated and alone, and she doesn't really understand why she's the way she is. And so for her, just seeing all these other people that have, as her mother puts it in the beginning of the book, these peculiarities, they're also peculiar, and yet they've figured out a way to sort of live and survive and be happy, and so for her it's all very inspirational. It's like it's sort of learning to accept yourself for her. Yeah.
Now there aren't a lot of books that have kind of the main characters be so far apart in age. I'm thinking there are a few. True Grit, for example. Mm. What made you decide to do that?
Well, I think the character of Johnny, it's a lot of it is related to certainly the premise of being in a car, in the backseat of a car. I spent a lot of time with my grandfather when I was younger, and we were very, very close. And he was very, very important to me. And so there's something, he's a very, very different person from Johnny Ribkins, but there's sort of a core of feeling between Eloise and Johnny that I really drew a lot on my own relationship with my grandfather. And I spent an awful lot of time in the backseat of his car also. So I was very impressed with him as a child. He was, kind of a heroic figure in my mind as well, but again, for completely different reasons. And so the book is, that's where a lot of sort of the inspiration came in terms of that. So, yeah, it's my grandfather.
Now
it has to do with that.
You lived with these characters for at least 4 years, probably longer because you had written the short story. You said the first chapter was a short story before that. So, are you done with these characters?
I don't know. I mean, there is a lot. There's a lot more to be said about them, and I'm sure it would be in a very different form. I'm interested in right now in writing about the Rib King, because a lot of what they remember is not accurate, and so that's a story or a novel that I've been working on. I'm really interested in writing that would be historical fiction about the actual life of the person they came to consider their family patriarch. And and there's I think a lot to be said about their specific experiences in the Justice Committee. So I would like, there's a lot more I would like to say and could say about them. It would be very, very different. Both of those would be very different books, set in different time periods and have very different themes.
Well, yes, so, and plus Eloise, who's just beginning.
And, that's true. Yeah.
And what does she do with her talent? And I want to know.
Well, that's great. No, that's wonderful. And it's true. I spent so much time with them. I probably know everything about them. Because I spent so much time also writing and rewriting the story and thinking about who they were and how they spoke and why they spoke that way. So I certainly, I think there's certainly a lot more I could say about most of the characters in the book.
Well, you should do that.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. Our guest today is Ladee Hubbard, author of The Talented Ribkins. Now, this book has won a number of awards. It's an Indie Next pick, a winner of the Faulkner Wisdom Prize, a winner of the 2016 Rona Jaffe Award. The Pushcart Prize was probably for a short story.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, so it's gotten a lot of attention, hasn't it?
I suppose so. Yeah. No, I mean, it has.
And has there been any overtures from the movie industry?
I'm just going to ask that because it would make a great movie.
Oh, that's nice. No, I would love that. I would really love that. Not as yet, but I would certainly love that. I would love to see them in a movie.
And it would be so timely because you've got this historical, it's not really a book about race, but it is a book about,
right.
About the struggles.
Yeah. And I think it would be a wonderful movie.
It would.
Well, that's really nice to hear. I would love that. I would certainly love that. That would be great. So, maybe.
So how does it feel for you? You worked on this a long time. This obviously was a goal, and now it's published. It's out there. It's getting a lot of attention. How does that feel for you?
Oh, it feels great. I feel wonderful about it. I really love the. I've spent so much time with these characters. I really love the characters. I'm glad that it's resonated with as many people as it has. And I know it's a pretty unusual book, so that makes it even more sort of gratifying because you don't know how things are people are going to interpret what you're doing. So I really appreciate it. Like anyone that reads it and enjoys it and appreciates my efforts, I'm very grateful for. It's it's wonderful.
And are you writing full time now?
No, I'm teaching. I'm actually teaching this. I'm teaching at Tulane. I'm teaching a class in literature.
So do you think that at some point you will be a full-time writer?
Oh, I would love that. Yeah. I would really love that. Maybe. But I love writing. I write every day. And I've done that for a while.
Do you journal?
And I really do like writing novels. That's certainly one thing I've learned from doing this, and I definitely would like to write another one.
Do you journal?
Huh?
Do you journal?
I do sometimes. I write a lot of short stories as well. So I just sometimes I journal though. Yeah.
Now, in your writing process, are you all on the computer, laptop, or do you do any by hand?
I write everything by hand first because I don't know if it's I prefer to write by hand. I feel like I can think differently when I'm writing with a pen than when I'm typing on a computer. So most things I write by hand first. And then when I'm editing them, I'll edit them on the computer. But it often helps me to write things by hand.
I think there's something to be said about that. And right before we went on the air here on Friday, the filmosophers who are right before us were talking about a documentary, which is an ode to the typewriter, and interviewing authors and actors and writers and different people who still really, really like using typewriters. So that's probably even a different, your mind is engaging in a somewhat different way there even than with computers. Yeah. I think it's interesting to me that you do that you write by hand, because I do feel like there's a connection between the mind and the hand that is holding a pen that is different.
Yeah, I do too. I don't know why that is. I don't know why I do that, but it helps to clarify things for me. A lot of times I find if I just take the time to write it by hand, and also because you can write notes to yourself in margins, and partly it might be like a visual thing.
Yeah, like you're mapping it out.
That's right. Yeah, and that's much easier to just do for me to do by hand a lot of times. So when I'm write for first drafts, I always do it by hand.
Now, when you started writing The Talented Ribkins, did you know where the story was going, or did you just have the characters and followed them?
No, yeah, I did not know where the story was going. And again, because I'd written the first, it's very different, but it was a short story, and the characters just stayed with me. It was just really Eloise and Johnny. So I really didn't know for a very long time. And it was just through writing about them that it started to make more sense to me.
How about, did you know how much Dawson would feature in the story from the beginning, or was that something that just kind of surprised you?
Oh, that's interesting. No, I did not know. I did not know initially how much he would feature in the story. So, again, it's sort of like a cynical, sort of, Johnny's, it becomes sort of like a fun house. It's a mirror for Johnny, and not a very positive one, so he sees a lot in that figure. Yeah, no, I did not know at all.
Yeah. It took me a little while to realize, but this name kept popping up. Like the second or third time, I'm like, well, who was that again? I had to go back and see where it was first introduced, and then I realized, okay, this means something. This isn't just an accidental reference to a politician, and yeah. So again, one more layer in the book. Well, Ladee, we are about out of time, and I want to thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.
You be sure and let us know if this is a movie, will you?
Oh, yeah.
No, absolutely, I will.
Okay.
I will.
Okay.
And I want to remind our listeners that we broadcast. And, Mom, you have some closing words for us today?
I do. This fits the book, I think. Okay, this is a 2017 Tony winner. Ben Platt was quoted in saying, "Don't waste any time trying to be like anybody but yourself, because the things that make you strange are the things that make you powerful."
Now,
beautiful.
Could that be any more fitting for this
perfect
book? I know, it is perfect. The book is The Talented Ribkins. It's available wherever books are sold. It's published by Melville, I believe.
Melville House,
which they do some really wonderful books.
Yeah.
We've been seeing a lot of great books coming from them. And see you next week on Writers' Voices.